And Kenzi, I'm going to unmute you. Maybe. There we go. I unmuted you. Okay. All right, guys. It is time. Let's go ahead and get started. It is 9:16 now. That is incorrect. I'm 9:16. You guys are 10:16. I'm in Central Time. You're in the ancient art of storytelling and what we can learn from it with Miss Kenzi Nevins. You will be muted during this class, and we'll open it up for questions with about 10 to 15 minutes remaining, or when Kenzi's ready. It is my great honor to introduce Kenzi Nevins. She's an award-winning writer with a passion for magic, realism, and mythology. She's a 28 graduate of Taylor University's professional writing and theater programs. Kenzi spent 2 semesters studying in the story-laden Wicklow Mountains of Eastern Ireland. Super jealous. In 2018, she won 2nd place for theater journalism and critique from the Kennedy Center for American College Theater, and her short story, The Last Freedom, was published in ebook and paperback by StoryShares in 2017. When she isn't writing, Kenzi can be found watering her fairy garden, so cool, experimenting with little-known tea flavors, or wandering the aisles of her small Kentucky Town Library. Kenzi, thank you for being here with us today. You are an agent with Kyle Literary Agency, and we are so blessed to have you here. So I'm going to mute myself and put my screen on because kids are waking up. Enjoy, Miss Kenzi.
Hi guys, so thank you so much, Hannah. I love this conference. I'm so excited to be here again. I don't know if I met any of you last year, but last year was my first year at the Kentucky Christian Writers Conference, and I love it. I hope I'll be able to come every year forever. So it's one of my favorites. Everyone's just so warm and inviting and encouraging to each other. So I'm glad all of you are here. This is a great conference, and I'm so excited that I get to teach this year. Like I said, I've done some other online conferences. This is the first one when I've actually been able to see anybody. So that's a little nerve-wracking, but I can only see a couple of you on the side of the screen. So, but it is exciting to know that there are actually people here, and it's not just I'm talking to a computer, which is how it's felt on a couple of the others. So welcome to this class. I'm gonna go ahead and start screen sharing because if I don't, I will get off topic very quick. Okay, so all right, so I'm calling this class The Ancient Art of Storytelling and What We Can Learn from It. This is sort of a unique class for me. This is the first time I've taught it, but if any of you were at the panel on Thursday night, I mentioned the fact that I love mythology. So I thought I would just give a little bit of a history of how I ended up teaching this class. I know I have been to many writers' conferences even before I was an agent. And like Hannah said in the intro, I am an agent and an author. I am in the process of querying a novel right now, but I've done devotionals, articles, blog posts, like she said, a short story, and social media managed for several different companies. But I'm coming at this topic from the point of view of an author. I think I will say one thing at the end from the point of view of an agent, but it's very important to me to come to this storytelling discussion from the point of view of an author. So that's sort of my starting point for this. I love mythology. I always have since I was a little kid. And one of the things that's always interested me the most about storytelling is the way that it's the same across a lot of different cultures and people groups. I think if any of you have been to the Creation Museum before in Kentucky, that's a big thing for us here because we live very close to it. They did a study a few years back about dragon myths in a bunch of different cultures and the similarities between them, which they were using as evidence sort of humans living at the same time as dinosaurs, which is very interesting to me. But I really kind of grabbed on to that idea of myths being the same across cultures. Why is that? What is it about stories that we as humans love? and what is it about them that's so powerful for us? And also, why do they show up the same in so many cultures? Why is there such a similar story structure? We can categorize stories into beginning, middle, and end, sort of. Why is that? Is there a framework for stories that always works? And so that's sort of where I'm starting with this. When I was in high school and I was sort of starting out as a writer, was the first time when someone asked me if I'd ever read The Hero with a Thousand Faces by Joseph Campbell. And at that time I hadn't, and I immediately went home and looked up what that was about because it felt like something I should know about as a writer. And that's sort of where I began my study of the mythic structure, which is something that I'm going to be talking about today. And I'm hopeful that in the coming years, when all of this COVID stuff lifts, I'm going to be pursuing graduate studies in that sort of thing. So it is something I'm very passionate about, very interested in, and I hope it's going to be kind of fun. I know sometimes being at conferences can be like drinking out of a fire hose. It's all super great information, but it's so much information. I went to my first conference when I was still in college, and I remember feeling like that, like, whoa, this is so much, and I can't even take it all in. And sometimes a lot of the information that we share at conferences about, you know, social media and branding and websites and marketing can be really scary, especially if you're someone like me who would prefer to write and not focus on all of that stuff. And so while I do think marketing is important, and you can come later, I think at 1 o'clock, and hear me talk about social media, right now I'm talking about story structure and writing, because hopefully that can be kind of fun and refreshing for everybody, to just talk about writing rather than all the other parts that make up a writer's career. So with that, I'm going to start. Stories. So as I said before, people have been telling stories for as long as we've existed. Even before there was any sort of written language, people were passing down their lineage and values and insights on life through verbal storytelling, which is what we now call myths. When God inspired the Bible, he chose to communicate much of it in the familiar format of a story. Stories were also Jesus's most common teaching tools. So that's something that I'm going to be going farther into throughout this talk, is why he chose to use that, because that was a really big deal for him and his teaching style. There are a ton of different genres in the Bible. You know, there's poetry, there's genealogies and lists of names, but a huge percentage of it is told in stories. And I believe there's a reason that God chose to do that. And so that's going to be the center of sort of our discussion of this topic. So we're going to talk, I'm just going to sort of go over the points that I'm going to be covering in this talk. Like Hannah said, I'll leave time for questions at the end. It might end up being a lot of time or a little, I'm not totally sure, because every time I've practiced this workshop, it's come out at a different time. So we'll find out. So the things I'm kind of going to be talking about are what we can learn from the importance of stories in human history. Like I said, stories are so important to humans, and they've continued to be even after the end of verbal storytelling culture. We are still telling stories. We're still using that as one of our main modes of communication. Why is that? We're going to talk about the 9 basic plots. On one of my first classes in college, I was a professional writing major. One of the first things the professor said to me was, if you think the story you're writing has been told before, you're right, because there are only 9 basic plots. So every story has been told before. And it sounds kind of discouraging at first glance, but I actually find that to be really encouraging. So I'm going to discuss later why I think that is. I'm also going to be talking about, like I said, Joseph Campbell and the mythic structure. He wrote A Hero with a Thousand Faces. He has, one of his students sort of simplified a lot of his research on story structure and simplified it into a book called The Writer's Journey, which I would definitely suggest to all of you. It's a great book. It's long, but it's very simple to understand. It's very interesting to read. So if you're looking for more information on this subject, The Writer's Journey is one that I would suggest. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about if there's a formula for writing a good story and what that formula is, if it exists. and if that exists, how we can apply that to novel writing and when we should deviate from it. So is there such a thing as the perfect story or the perfect story format? And what does that mean for us as writers and as people who are trying to write stories that are unique and different? So we're going to start with the history of myths. Like I said, I love mythology. I spent 2 semesters and a summer in Ireland, and a lot of what I was doing when I was there was studying Irish history and myths. And so that sort of really became the center of my interest of human cultures and the way that people tell stories. I'm one of those people who sees everything as a story. I've been a writer since I was 11, but before that I was an avid reader. I chose reading over friends, so I didn't really have any friends until I was in like middle school or later, because I spent all my time reading, recess and everything. Like Hannah said, I studied theater in college, and did a ton of theater in high school and earlier. That is another form of storytelling to me. I'm one of those people who sees everything that happens in life, relationship failures, job changes, everything is a plot twist. And I just see everything in my life as building into some huge story, which has been a very encouraging way to look at life for me. But also, that's just the way I am. So stories have been my starting point for understanding everything about my life. I love history, and they've also been a starting point for me in understanding history. So why do we tell stories? Because of the way that God created the human brain, we find it easier to remember stories than anything else, especially easier than long lists of facts or numbers. Anyone who's been in a math class probably knows this. The reason I think that we use story problems and that those have become so popular in especially elementary school age is because they're easier to remember and understand than just giving a list of facts or theorems or steps to complete a problem. This is also the reason that Jesus used parables, which I mentioned earlier. He believed that they were the easiest way for his listeners to understand what he's talking about. So you've got this big subject like the kingdom of God. And then he says, the kingdom of God is like a shepherd with his sheep. And all these ancient Hebrews who are around shepherds all the time are like, yes, we understand that. We're with you. And that's so much easier than trying to explain all this theology to a huge group of mostly uneducated people. So he believed that that was the easiest way for them to understand, also the easiest way for them to remember. If you are telling me some huge list of phone numbers or addresses, I might remember it for an hour. If you tell me a story, I'll probably be able to repeat it at 3 or 4 dinner parties after that, because stories just fit in our human brain better. And if you can hear that really loud sound behind me right now, I apologize for that. Somebody's doing yard work outside, and I don't know how long that's going to go on. But so the great thing about this conference and the fact that this is a Christian writing conference is that I can come at this from the point of view of my faith. I teach at both types of conferences, but I love being able to teach at Christian writing conferences because I can talk about my faith more openly. And that's a really big deal for me, especially when discussing this particular topic. And I'll go into why later on. So the 9 basic plots, like I said, that was one of the first things I was told in college. And at the time, I was sort of like, what? This new, young, beginning writer, you're telling me I can't write a story that's unique. And my professor said, every story has been written before, but no story has been written the way that you're going to write it. And that to me is a really encouraging thing to remember when we discuss the 9 basic plots. A very popular author who I follow on Twitter was saying the other day that her new book is coming out, and lots of people have been telling her it's a very similar plot to another book that came out about 10 years ago. And she said that may be true, but you can give 10 authors the same premise and they'll write 10 completely different books, which is the truth. God is a creative God, and he is, because we're created in his image, he has instilled in us the ability to create. And we have an almost infinite ability to take these 9 basic overarching plots and turn them into a million different stories. And we have throughout human history. And I think that's one of the great things about humans. So I'm going to just be covering what those are really quick, but rest assured, your story will still be unique because no one will tell it with the voice, the interest, the passion, and the characters that you do because of your specific life and the specific experiences that you've had. And so these are just sort of starting points that help us to divide stories into genres. And from there, you can twist and turn them into a million different things. So the 9 basic plots, the first one is overcoming the monster. And all the examples that I gave are mostly Disney because I'm a Disney person, but I was just trying to pick things that I hoped most people would recognize. So hopefully that will be true for you. If not, I've got some things to watch and read, I guess. So overcoming the monster is this plot. It can be in any different genre, but basically it's the story of a hero who has to defeat some large thing in order to rescue somebody or save their city or something like that. The big thing can be, you know, a boss or a company, or it can be an actual monster. There's a whole bunch of different ways that you can spin this. And the example that I used is Frozen. Frozen is actually a great example of twisting and turning these plot ideas a little bit. Because if any of you have seen that, you know the monster is actually the hero's older sister who doesn't intend to be a monster. And so the hero is faced with both stopping the effects of the curse that her sister has started while also not harming her sister in the process. So you can see how that's sort of a change on that typical plot that gives it more emotion and more complexity. Next, we have the rags to riches story. Some really good examples of that are Aladdin, Cinderella, and The Prince and the Pauper by Mark Twain, if any of you have read that. That's basically the story of a hero who starts out somehow poor and destitute. Again, this can be in any genre. They somehow, through meeting somebody or finding some treasure or something, are able to climb the ranks of power and wealth. And then that story has a lot of different endings. Usually either the hero realizes that the power and wealth isn't worth it, so they go back to their poor and destitute days, or they realize the power and wealth isn't worth it, but they're stuck there, which is sort of a tragic ending, or they figure out that they can use this power and wealth to help other people who are like they used to be. The next typical plot is the quest story. So any of you who are really familiar with the Lord of the Rings will know this one. That's probably like the pinnacle of quest stories, the most obvious example. Another one would be Homer's Odyssey, which is a story about this guy who spends years and years trying to get back over the sea to his wife and has to go through all these different adventures and trials in order to get there. Very similar to the Lord of the Rings. So in this plot, the hero, usually aided by a whole bunch of allies, is trying to either find something or destroy something. And in that process has to face all these tests and trials, usually multiple villains, and in order to like finally be successful. This story works most often in fantasy. You'll find this one a lot in fantasy, but it can be applied to a lot of different genres. And this one is interesting in that it's one of the plots that comes with the most stuff that people expect. So tropes, I guess, sort of, that people expect to come with it. You have the group of allies, like the Fellowship of the Ring. You have the multiple villains. You have the mentor, who usually has lots of information and generally dies somewhere in the middle of the story. There's a lot of things that people expect to come with quest stories, which can be helpful if you're writing one because it helps you know what your readers are expecting. The bad thing about that is, though, it can start to feel very formulaic. So if you're writing a quest story, you just have to be aware it's important to change things and add emotion and complexity, because there have been so many copycat novels of the Lord of the Rings that people are starting to get tired of that formula. So you need to do the work to make the story unique and not just another rip off of the Lord of the Rings, because in the years after that was written, there was like hundreds of those. So the next plot is the voyage and return. This is the story of a hero who goes to a different world, whether that's literal or metaphorical. At first, they think it's really great and everything is much better there than it was in their previous world. Then they begin to realize that this other place has some sort of dark underbelly, or it's not so great as they first thought it was. And then they have to undertake this journey in order to get back home. A good example of this is The Wizard of Oz, or I don't know if any of you know Coraline by Neil Gaiman. There's a movie and a book, but it's basically the story of this little girl who doesn't like her family, and she wants to have a different family, a more perfect one, you know, who doesn't have rules and doesn't discipline and that sort of thing, and ends up entering this alternate reality where this dream family exists. And at first she thinks everything is great and perfect, but then after a while begins missing her real family, who are actually real people and not just what she wanted them to be. And so then she has to undertake this journey to get back home to her real family and away from this dream or alternate reality family. The C.S. Lewis's The Voyage of the Dawn Treader is also very loosely based on this plot type, and you can see some of the similarities in that if any of you are familiar with the Chronicles of Narnia. So a tragedy, this one is more commonly used in theater, so I'm not going to talk about it much here because it doesn't take place much in novels. Basically, a tragedy is any story that doesn't end well for the hero. So Romeo and Juliet is a great example. If any of you are familiar with Romeo and Juliet, both of the heroes die in the end. A lot of Shakespeare's plays are like that. So, but it doesn't necessarily mean death. It just means any story in which this hero is worse off at the end than he was at the beginning. There's not a happy ending, in other words. Romeo and Juliet is actually a really good example of what I was talking about, where every story that's been written has been written before. Before Romeo and Juliet, this storyline of two lovers separated by insurmountable odds already existed, and it has existed after Shakespeare also. If any of you are familiar with the musical West Side Story, it's exactly the same story, except in New York with immigrant gangs. But it comes off feeling like a completely different story, despite the fact that we all know it's just Romeo and Juliet. So that's sort of a very extreme example of the same story being carried over in different plots, but it happens a lot. So the rebirth story, this one is one that's also not used a lot. It's considered to be a little bit old-fashioned. Basically, in this story, the hero dies in some way, whether that's like real or metaphorical, and someone else has to raise them out of that death into a new life. Sleeping Beauty is a good example of this. The problem with this plot type is that it doesn't require much agency on the part of the hero. So, for example, in Sleeping Beauty, there's nothing she can do to wake herself up from the curse. The prince has to come and do it for her, which is the reason that a lot of old fairy tales can end up feeling like they fall a little bit flat, especially for women who feel like they're always sort of portrayed as like the damsel in distress type. I did read an article, a very interesting article, that said a better version of Sleeping Beauty would be written from the prince's perspective, which I actually thought was a really interesting idea, because the prince is the person who actually has agency in that story. He's the one who makes the choice to break the curse. And your hero should generally, in all story types, be the person who is acting to make the action happen. So the next one is mystery. I don't know if any of you are mystery writers. I love mysteries, but that's a really big plot type encompassing Sherlock Holmes, Agatha Christie, all those types of books, cozy mysteries, anything like that. Some people don't like this plot type as much because it doesn't include a lot of emotion on the part of the hero. So the hero is usually the detective. It's usually some detective who comes in to solve a mystery, and there are all these strange, kooky characters. A lot of times it's like someone has died and they have this huge, very eccentric family, that sort of thing. And the hero has to pick through the stories of all these eccentric characters to figure out what happened. The detective doesn't have a lot of emotional investment in that story. He's just sort of doing his job. So I find these stories to be really entertaining, but some people don't like them because of that. However, like I said, there are ways to change up that plot too. If any of you are familiar with Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie, I'm not going to spoil it for you because it's great. And if you've seen the movie, it's really good. But she creates a situation in which at the end, the detective, who is the hero, is faced with a really important emotional choice. And so that sort of causes him to have emotional stakes in the story, which makes the story feel more emotional and complex to the reader. So the last of the 9 plots that we're going to talk about today is Rebellion Against the One. This one was really popular in the dystopian phase. So if any of you remember the trends in YA between like 2006 and 2012, everything was dystopian. And most of them followed this plot. So Star Wars would fall into this, if any of you are familiar with that. The Hunger Games, 1984, Fahrenheit 451, all of those classic dystopians, as well as some newer ones, like I said, the Hunger Games Divergent, which is this idea of the hero having to rebel against this big evil force, which is usually the government, in order to bring about some positive change for the people they live around. This usually ends in 2 ways. Either the hero wins, such as in the Hunger Games, and is able to set up a world that is more fair and equal to everyone living in it, or the person realizes that there's nothing they can do to defeat this evil force, and they end up becoming a part of it themselves, which is more of the tragic ending. So like I said, 9 basic plots. There's a million ways to pull these apart and change them and make them more complex. So don't feel like your story is necessarily defined by one of them. You can also mix them, which is another great point of human creativity. So I'm going to move on to talking a little bit about the mythic structure, which is related in a way. So like I was talking about Joseph Campbell's work at the beginning about the writer's journey. So basically, Joseph Campbell, he lived in, I think, the 40s or 50s, and he did a bunch of studies on the structure of myths. Why is it that so many cultures in the world have myths that seem extremely similar, which is the thing I was talking about with the Creation Museum study. I don't know if any of you have ever had to read the Epic of Gilgamesh in school. That's one of the oldest existing myths. It's from Sumerian Babylonian culture, but there is, inside that story, there's a flood story, which is extremely similar to the flood story in the Bible. And a lot of cultures have very similar flood stories. And so Joseph was very interested in, why does that happen? Why do so many cultures have these elements of story that are the same? And is there a structure that creates like the perfect story that humans prefer when telling a story? He was not a believer, and so he was coming at this from an atheistic perspective. A lot of Christians have since then taken his work from a Christian perspective, which is the way that I would consider it to be. To me, it's very, very telling that the structure of Jesus's life as one continuing story fits almost perfectly into this plot structure. I believe that's because if we're talking about the perfect story, that story is the story of Jesus, which the Bible says is engraved on every human heart. All of us, even those of us who have never heard the story of Jesus, are searching for it in our souls and in our lives. And so I believe that we tell stories that mimic it, because that story is so deeply ingrained in all of us that all of our myths tend to feel like they were copied off of it. So I call that like the prime story or the first story. And I believe that a lot of these elements, the reason that we like them is because we're all searching for that story. And so that has a lot to do with the reason that we tell stories, and also the way that we tell stories looks. So basically, Joseph divided the typical story structure into different steps. And he said, this is the basic framework of a story, and then you can change and shift this within your own story. But a lot of these elements people are going to expect, So knowing about them is very helpful when trying to put together the framework of a story. The best example I can use with these is Star Wars. George Lucas was a huge fan of Joseph Campbell's work, and basically what he did was he just took the mythic structure and put it in space, and he didn't change it at all. So Star Wars includes all of these elements and also some of the character archetypes that are part of this mythic structure. So the basic outline is you have the ordinary world, no matter what plot this is a part of. It applies really well to Quest, but it fits into all of the plot types. The hero starts out in the ordinary world, whether that's an actual world or it's their home or their city or their family, whatever. They are somehow called to adventure. They at first refuse that call and decide they're not going to go. Then they meet a mentor who tells them the reasons that they should go and usually gives them some sort of information that will help them in their quest. The hero is then forced to cross the threshold into adventure. So for those of you who have seen Star Wars, after, sorry, is there somebody trying to say something? Okay. After Luke decides that after he meets the mentor who is Obi-Wan Kenobi and decides that he's not going to go on the quest, he then returns home to find that his entire family has been killed. So now there's nothing on this planet for him. He has to go on the quest. Then the hero is usually forced to cross the threshold somehow. There are then a lot of tests and allies and enemies, which is the whole middle part of any story. The hero will, make friends, and there's love interests. There's different subplots that happen. There are enemies who are met. But through this whole time, the hero is somehow moving towards the climax, which is in the Bible, this whole section of Jesus's life when he's doing all these miracles and picking up disciples and all that sort of stuff. The whole time he's moving in a circuit towards Jerusalem. So he knows the climax is coming and he's moving toward it. Then we have the approach to the inmost cave, which is usually when the hero begins to gets to the point when they're approaching their goal, the thing that they're trying to get. So whether that's like a romantic relationship or like a treasure or to rescue some person or whatever, they're almost there. Then there's usually some kind of giant ordeal that happens, like a big fight. The hero somehow gets what they were looking for and they begin to travel back. Now it's on the road back that they usually have a big conflict with the villain. That usually happens. It can happen during the ordeal section. It usually does. But there's usually an even bigger conflict that happens on the road back. And this is the point at which the hero is forced to rethink themselves, their hopes and fears. Usually they have to give up a lot of things. They might lose something, whether that be a person or a job or whatever. And in some way, the hero dies. So usually this is not physical, but something dies. So whether it's the hero's fear or, fear of commitment or inability to love or innocence or whatever, something dies and the hero is resurrected from that into a new and better life. So that's the point at which, the prodigal comes home. The hero finds who they were meant to be and is able to conquer all of the odds. In Jesus's case, obviously, this is a literal resurrection, which is why I think that the story of his life very closely reflects this structure, which is why I think the structure was in large part drawn from it. At that point, we have the section called The Return with the Elixir, which is the hero goes back to the ordinary world, somehow changed and better. So that's the basic structure. And like I said, this will change with whatever story that you're writing. It's never going to fit that exactly. But for beginning writers and for young writers, it's a really great place to start. I learned to write novels using and copying exactly that structure with, my own characters and plot and stakes and everything. And that taught me how to write a novel. And after that, I was able to sort of veer off that into tons of different plots. And so if you're teaching kids to write, that structure is a great thing to use. Also, if you're just starting out and you want to practice with a few novels, that can be a great way to do it, is through using that structure, because it just sort of outlines everything for you. So it makes it easy to sort of figure out where everything fits. The structure, the way that Joseph Campbell wrote it out, also included a lot of archetypes, character archetypes, which are types of characters that we are used to seeing in books and movies. So you have the hero, which is usually the person called upon to save the world, undertake the quest, change their own life, whatever. You have the mentor, which is very common in quest stories. It doesn't exist in all genres, but a lot of times in some form it does. There's usually some form of older character who's giving advice to the hero. Usually it's someone who's undertaken a similar quest or been through a similar life situation before and is in possession of some kind of knowledge the hero will need. In the quest story type, the mentor very often dies, like Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings, or in some way leaves, because the hero is then forced to take that wisdom that they've gained from the mentor and actually use it on their own, because of the fact that the mentor is no longer there. The ally, this is usually multiple people in any story who help the hero on their quest and often star in subplots of their own. This is true. Allies are my favorite. I love the friends. My friends are always my favorite characters in any book of any genre. I love it when the hero has a bunch of like really quirky and interesting friends. It makes things super fun. A lot of times the love interest is one of these. If it's a romance, the love interest is usually a separate character. But in other story types where romance exists, but it isn't the main plot, the love interest is often one of the allies. So then the last and most important character archetype we have is the villain. This is the person fighting against the hero reaching their goal, usually for selfish or nefarious reasons, but not always. You've probably heard it said that all villains should be a little bit sympathetic. Some villains are a lot sympathetic if you're one of those people who loves shades of gray in a story, but there has to be something about the villain that makes them a villain. So whether that's they're trying to obtain a good thing, but they're going about it in a wrong way, or they believe that the cost of a few people is okay as long as it saves some others, that sort of thing that we would consider to be not moral. They have to somehow be in opposition to the hero morally. The villain is an interesting character because for some reason, a lot of us tend to leave this one out. I know at least when I started writing, it was very rare that in my original plot, there would actually be a human villain. I always wanted the villain to be like society or something. And here's what I'm telling you. You can do that once you're a really good writer, maybe. But when you're first starting out, I would definitely encourage you to have a real human villain, because it is very hard to make a character's internal stakes high enough to make the reader keep reading, to make the reader feel like the action of the story is viable. It's very hard to do that with only stakes inside the character. Outward stakes make it a lot easier to force a character to act. So it's, especially when you start writing or when you're teaching kids to write, human villains are very important. We need some kind of outward state, something to push the hero to action. And a lot of times just inward stuff isn't enough, because we'll be like, well, why didn't they just decide not to do it? Well, because they couldn't. They had no choice. That's sort of what we want our readers to feel like. So the idea of formula, this is the last point in this workshop. The hero's journey and the 9 plots are not a formula. I want to make sure that I am very clear about that. It's a framework. So you're not meant to follow these things point by point. Like I said, when you're learning to write, it's helpful. And as is an example, Star Wars is an example of, you can follow it point by point and have your story be very successful. but most of us want to deviate from it a little bit, and that's totally fine. The point of having a framework in the first place is that you need to be aware of what people are looking for in a story. And the framework differs a little bit with every genre, and you want to be aware of what the reader wants. So, for example, with romantic comedy, there are very specific things that people want to happen, and you need to be aware of those because otherwise your book won't be successful as a romantic comedy. There are ways that you can deviate from them and make your story unique, but you still need to be aware of how much readers will tolerate as far as deviations from what they're expecting in a specific genre. So take risks, absolutely take risks, but make sure you take criticism and advice. Like I said, there's a reason that humans prefer stories that have a clear beginning, middle, and end. That's how we're wired. A lot of more experimental writers will experiment with like stream of consciousness stories and stuff like that. Generally, those aren't very popular outside of very specific artsy communities because regular people, we don't like to read that way as much. We like to read a story that has a clear beginning, middle, and end. That's just how God wired us. It's following after the story of Jesus. So do take risks, but make sure you take criticism and advice. If someone tells you your story isn't working, this is one of the really important things about having beta readers. Beta readers are people who will read your book for you. Usually they are writers or readers themselves. They should definitely be readers, and they should be well read in the genre that you're writing in and able to give you honest criticism. And if they're telling you this doesn't work, or like this isn't something that I think works in a sci-fi novel, you need to listen to that because you don't have to take their advice exactly, but you need to be aware that your readers might feel the same way. So you maybe want to like go back and reevaluate that a little bit. Think about, is there a way I could keep the uniqueness of this story but still have it offer what readers are looking for when they pick up a sci-fi novel or whatever. So the last thing is, this is one of my favorite quotes by John Steinbeck, and it's, "Now that you don't have to be perfect, you can be good." And I apply this to writing in a lot of ways, but especially here. Now that you know that if there is one perfect story, it's the story of Jesus, and none of us are ever going to be able to replicate that. So now that you're not trying to write the perfect story, you can write things that are good. That's all I have for y'all. So if people have questions, I'm gonna stop sharing this screen, I guess.
Okay. All right. Let me put you guys back into view. I've had to move upstairs because people are waking up in my house. Okay. Let's see. Kenzi, excellent job. I have just loved listening to you, and right, I do believe that the story, Jesus' story, is just ingrained and it just comes out of us naturally. Even as non-believers, when you write, you just can't help but write the gospel because it's just so. Okay, all right. Let me scroll through and see if I have missed any questions. Here's one that just pops up immediately. Can a rebellion story be against a good force?
Yes. So, like I said, there's lots of ways that you can make stories more complex. I don't know, it doesn't happen a lot, but it can. Like a lot of times it's more common for you to have a story where the hero thinks the rebellion that they're part of is good, only to later find out that it's bad. And so that sort of stuff can happen. It really adds into the complexity of the story, especially if the force, some parts of it are good, but some parts of it are bad. A hallmark of those rebellion stories is kind of like breaking down of the hero's black and white ideals.
Like, I mean, even Star Wars, I'm thinking of, where, Anakin is like, he thinks, he turns to the dark side thinking that he's
yeah.
good. You know what I mean?
Right, exactly.
Okay, here's a question from Timothy. Does combining plots weaken the story because there is no single driving plot for readers?
I don't think so. I think you just have to be careful and make sure that your plot is like streamlined and very clear. I mean, obviously you can have a story that is both rags to riches and a quest, where the hero is poor and destitute in the beginning, and then finding wealth and power requires them to go on a quest. Aladdin is sort of that way. So you can do that. I don't think it weakens the story. You just have to be sure that your story is doing one thing and not trying to like be a whole bunch of things at once, which usually readers can tell you.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Let's see. Thank you for your presentation. Thank you. Thank you. Agree. Best explanation of the hero's journey I've heard. Thank
Aww.
you. Is it acceptable in fiction to have the hero be his own villain?
It is hard. And this is why I like pressed the point of the human villain. I think experienced writers can do that, where, like I said, where all the stakes are internal, but it is very difficult to do because you do want your hero to be likable. And if your readers don't like the hero, that can make the book very difficult to read, even if you have an anti-hero or something like that. So I'm not going to say it can't be done, but I'm struggling to think of an example at the moment that I thought worked.
Okay. All right, here's one. What is your personal opinion about putting magic in Christian fiction?
My personal opinion. Okay, so there are a lot of different opinions about this. I write magic realism, so personally I love magic. I think J.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis are two of my favorite authors. They both used it. I believe that in writing fiction, magic can be sort of a good allegory of different things in life that can be either good or evil depending on how you use them. I read a lot of magic books as a child in a Christian household, and that wasn't a detriment to me or my faith in any way. So I love magic, and I think it can add a lot to a story. And so I don't go in for like, I don't know, like super intense like witchcraft or darkness or anything like that. But I personally believe that especially in fantasy and that sort of genre, magic can be a force for good and also a force for evil and just a force for learning in Christian fiction.
Okay, that is an excellent answer. All right, is it bad to have overlap in non-plots? I think that's kind of a similar question.
Yeah, no, I don't think so. A lot of plots, most stories will overlap those plots a little bit. It's rare now to find a story that's just one of them.
Here's one. Please give an example of comedy.
Oh, right. So I did realize this halfway through. I somehow skipped comedy. That's one of the 9 plots. Comedy is a hard one to define because it's meant a lot of different things. In theater, if any of you are really well versed in theater, it basically just means any story with a good ending. So all of Shakespeare's comedies, they're funny, but they're really just stories where everything ends up working out for the hero, as opposed to a tragedy where things end up not working out. But comedy has taken on a different meaning depending on what generation it is. So these days, it tends to apply more to romantic comedy. So examples of that are mostly in movies. So you have like Leap Year and You've Got Mail, and all those type of movies are romantic comedies. That's also become really popular in books recently. And there are some very clear tropes that people expect in romantic comedy. And so these days, that's sort of what comedy stands for. It can also just mean anything that's funny, where like the voice of the writer is overall humorous.
Okay, thank you. We do have one from Lori. This is kind of, I guess, a conference question. This morning, they mentioned there might be a lunchtime Zoom hangout to meet other attendees. I couldn't find this information on the conference page. Can you tell me about this? Okay, so on our super secret conference page, there should be a tab. If there is not, then we can figure that out. Also, she says, nice job, Kenzi. You're well versed in literature and articulate about expressing your thoughts. Well done.
Thank you.
I can check on that site too, the conference page in just a minute. Okay.
Somebody says in the chat that the link might be on the Facebook page.
Oh, okay. There we go. Check. Thank you for seeing that. Check the Facebook page. What type of story is most popular in YA? Speculative?
What do you say?
And then it says like speculative.
Yeah, it depends. Like I said, with fantasy and sci-fi novels, the most popular is definitely The Quest or Rags to Riches. Sometimes The Voyage and Return. I would say in most YA novels that I've read, they're probably some version of a quest.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Isn't okay, I guess this one's from Rachel Knapp. She says, isn't that the definition of fantasy anyway? Magic?
Yeah, I would say it's hard to write fantasy without any sort of magic whatsoever. I would agree with that.
Okay. Sorry, I'm getting text messages in the conference. Okay. Let's see. Magic is a great way to portray the spiritual world we live in.
Yeah, that's true too.
Yep, Hallie posted okay, here we go. Yes, there's the link that you guys were talking about you were wanting to. Great presentation. Enjoyed this so much. Excellent job, guys. We have just a little bit left. I'm going to unmute all y'all. And if you have questions, please feel free to ask. So unmuting, maybe unmuting. Unmute all. Okay, unmute all.
Unmute all.
All y'all.
Oh, yeah.
Southern.
All of you.
It's all y'all. You're right.
How about that? You were so well versed, we're speechless.
Yeah.
I love books. I love literature.
That's awesome. It was very evident.
Thank you.
You know, when you were talking about not echoey. Better?
Yeah.
Okay, when you were talking about how, you know, God, all stories are really God's stories, that is something that I look for in my own life. It's interesting to see them.
Right, exactly.
Okay, let's see. Are there topics echoing to you guys?
Please.
What'd you say?
My mic is like acting up. Okay, maybe it's just mine. Are there topics your literary agency is particularly in need of?
So Kyle is actually closed at the moment. Does mine sound weird? I don't know.
Yeah.
Sounds weird on my end. Anyway, Kyle is actually closed to submissions right now. A few of the agents in particular, though, are still open. So I'm open right now for a short time.
Okay. Kenzi, there you go, girly. I just everybody.
I am open until the end of July. So after the Realm Makers Conference in July is when I'm going to close submissions. And I'm looking for YA and middle grades specifically. I think we also have an agent who's open looking for crime novels and thrillers. That's Jory Hannah. And then Krissa Keenan is looking for contemporary YA romance. I think those are the biggest things that we're looking for right now.
Okay. Any other questions? You can unmute yourself and ask. I think that possibly unmuting everyone caused some feedback issues.
I was the one that asked for an example of a comedy.
Mm-hmm.
And was wondering if you would think Diary of a Wimpy Kid would fall underneath that.
Yes, definitely. Those books are hilarious, and it has that that comedic voice. And that sort of comedic voice is very popular in middle grade, and I think it's super fun.
Okay, we have a question. Which publishing house is it? Do you mean what literary agency that Kenzi's with? Is that what you mean?
Yes, that's what I meant.
Yeah, Kyle, C-Y-L-E.
Okay.
Kyle Literary.
And Kyle, he's made his name like an acronym, right?
Yes, it's very weird. Kyle is actually his name. Kyle Young is the head of the agency, but the acronym also stands for Kyle Young Literary Elite.
Gotcha. Okay.
He thinks it's really funny. I just call it Kyle Literary because that's easiest. But yes. And then my personal website, you can see, which is kenzimelody.com. You can see like what I'm specifically looking for, and I like put on there when I'm closed to things, so you'll always know when I'm closed or open.
And find her on Instagram. She's always posting some really fun stuff.
Yeah. Later I'm doing a social media class, so if anybody's interested in that, it's happening.
I have a question
Yes.
about literary agencies. When would you need that in your writing journey?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Basically, you just got to decide which direction you want to go. So there's a lot of different directions you can go with publishing, either self-publishing or small indie publishers or traditional publishing. And if you're going the traditional route, like if you want to be with one of the big 5 houses and all their many, many imprints, or if you want to be some of the mid-sized houses to only take solicited submissions. So if you want to write for them, and you are going to need an agent in order to be considered by one of those publishers. So if you've decided that's the direction that you want your career to go, there's a lot of small publishing houses that will take unsolicited manuscripts that don't have agents. But also the great thing about an agent is that they're really helpful when it comes to like contracts and stuff like that. A lot of that stuff that authors don't understand fully and shouldn't need to, because it takes a lot of time and research. The agent can help with that. So if you want to be traditionally published by a mid-sized or larger house, and you have a manuscript that's been through several drafts and has had beta readers look at it and has been edited and everything, then you would write a query letter and research agents, see which ones you think would be a good fit, because there's tons of them. Follow them on social media or whatever, make a list, and then you would query them based on what their specific submissions guidelines are. Every agent has different submission guidelines. I always ask for a query letter in the first 3 chapters. Some agents look for something else. So you just got to make sure you know what the submission guidelines are. But that's usually when I tell people it's time to look for an agent.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Okay, we have a question here. How is your social media class different from Tony's? I'm not sure which to take. I will say that Tony's is more about growing a following, like investing in the people that you have, basically kind of building a cheerleader type squad. That's what I know specifically, and you can speak to yours, Kenzi.
Yeah, I think hers is going deeper into, once you have the accounts, like building that following. Mine is going to be an overview of what I think are the 4 most important social media platforms, why I think an author needs platform, and what you need to know about like the different platforms to choose which ones you're going to be on, and just sort of some like it's a very wide range overview that was created for people who either don't have a social media presence yet, or have a small one and aren't sure where to go with it as far as an author.
Right, we have about 1 more minute left. Does anyone else, well, actually we just hit 10:15. One last question, or I'm sorry, 11:15.
How would you describe the current middle grade Christian fiction fantasy market?
So overall, in the market in general and Christian, middle grade is doing really well. I forget who was saying it. It was either Bob or Chip in the agent panel that publishing is kind of like a tide and things go in and out. That's super true. And middle grade is definitely in right now in a lot of different areas. So I would say, I believe with Christian fantasy, that is also true, though, like they said in the panel, fiction that is very specifically Christian is already going to be harder to sell because there aren't a lot of publishing houses that are looking for it anymore, with the difficulties with Lifeway closing all their stores and that sort of thing. Most of the big Christian houses, Tyndale in particular, and also Thomas Nelson and Zondervan, are looking for clean fiction with Christian values, but that doesn't specifically focus around a salvation message. But middle grade is doing well.
Okay. All right. I'm talking to Tony right now on my phone. Kenzi, thank you so much for being here. Our next classes are at 1 o'clock. So you guys have a nice little lunch break there. You can jump on the Facebook site and meet up with people for lunch if you would like to. The next classes that we have, Kenzi, you are teaching social media and its uses for authors.
Yeah.
We have building your tribe on social media with Tony Shallow, video marketing for authors with Hallie Bridgman, and the publishing contract with Chip McGregor. So thank you all for being here. Give Kenzi a round of applause.
Thank you guys so much. It was so fun.
And you guys have a fabulous day.